Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast. I'm your podcast host, Peter Ahmad, recording from Cape Town, South Africa since June 2019. The Talking Transformation podcast provides an open and accessible platform for built environment professionals and interest groups to share their reflections and aspirations relating to the transformation of places and spaces in South Africa. It's intended to be a celebration of the individuals and community groups who are supporting formal and informal processes that are addressing the challenges of South Africa's history and shaping the future of our neighbourhoods and cities. Welcome back to the Talking Transformation podcast, and great news to be joined by our guest Tanya Zack, based up in Johannesburg, to talk about her new book, The Chaos Precinct. We spoke to Tanya back in February of 2023 about her preceding book, the Wake Up, This is Joburg book, and the partnership and collaboration she had with photographer Mark Lewis. And this book continues on the conversation about the Johannesburg inner city, but this time really focusing in on one of the precincts within the Joburg CBD, which has become really a very transformed space within that inner city. The so-called Chaos Precinct is one that is inhabited and utilized primarily by migrants, including a very strong Ethiopian migrant community. And you're going to hear about the transformation of the buildings, the high-rise commercial buildings that have given way to micro trading spaces, on-street shopping from street vendors, and a complete and utter transformation of the economy and the property market in these spaces. The book delves into the dynamic and ever-changing nature of the central business district, those using it, those inhabiting it, and the conflicts that sometimes arise in relation to governance, in relation to the challenges of operating as a migrant worker within the South African context. It also brings in issues of social dynamics and the identity and belonging. In fact, one of the elements which was completely intriguing for me was the return journey that Tanya makes up into Ethiopia to retrace the steps of those migrant workers here in South Africa back to their homestead in the Ethiopian cities. So the Chaos Precinct really promises to be a compelling read, offering deep insights into the dynamic and ever-changing nature of the Johannesburg inner city space. If you're watching along on YouTube, absolutely fantastic images that accompany the video and the podcast, and I hope you'll enjoy these images and the class and the quality of those images that Mark Lewis, who we interviewed way back in February 2023 with Tanya, I think you'll really enjoy that. So without further delay, let's deep dive into our conversation with Tanya Zack, the stories and the experiences that have shaped the Chaos Precinct. Hope you enjoy the episode. So it's just gone 10 o'clock on the 17th of July. Where has the year gone? Here we are on the Talking Transformation podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have another return guest, Tanya Zack, up in Joburg. Tanya, it's lovely to see you. Hope you've been keeping well. How have you been keeping, and what's news your side?
All very well, thank you. And I suppose the big news is that my book will launch in the next month, my book, The Chaos Precinct. And so we're building up to that.
It seems you've been very, very busy. If I'm not mistaken, the last time we talked, you were publishing the book on Johannesburg at that stage, the Wake Up Joburg, which I think was a very successful collaboration with Mark Lewis. And if I'm not mistaken, you're working with Mark again, or certainly his images in the book are very, very powerful. But the narrative, the story of this Chaos Precinct, tell us a bit about the place and why you've chosen it for a deep dive in terms of this new book.
So the Chaos Precinct is set in the so-called Ethiopian Quarter in the inner city of Johannesburg, which is the cross-border shopping hub. It's where people come from all around Southern Africa to shop for fast fashion. And it was pioneered by Ethiopian migrants as a trading post in Johannesburg. But it's an extraordinary space which exists in what were medical buildings. So these high-rise office towers on Jeppe Street, now called Rahima Musa, but still called Jeppy by the protagonists in the book, and by people who shop there and people who trade there. And they have repurposed what were redundant office towers into secret shopping centres. Well, 20 years later, less and less secret. But these are shopping centres that exist as cupboard-sized shops that fill these buildings, up to 5 or 6 floors, and above that is warehousing and storage of this fast fashion. And it is an absolute shopping mecca in Johannesburg.
Take us right back to the beginning, Tanya. I think in the book you articulate you have a beautiful sort of scene narrated of you arriving there. You talk about your mom, who worked, if I remember correctly, in the Labour Court in town, and you would arrive in this precinct, and how it was then and how it has transformed over this period into what you start to go into. Tell us about that, those early years of your recollection of it versus what it is now.
So I've always lived in Johannesburg, and grew up on the edge of the inner city in a suburb called Judithspal, attached to Bertram's. My mother worked at the Department of Labour on Bree Street, and I would, from the age of 7 or 8, often catch a bus into town to meet her. And the bus would stop on Pritchard Street outside a sweet shop, actually, and I would then walk across town to meet my mother at her office. But the extraordinary thing the thing that sits with me is that my mother used to be able to recite the names of the streets from west to east and north to south of the inner city. And I also made it my business to learn those street names. And as the bus would come into town, I would anticipate the next road and the next road. Even now, as I say in the book, when I walk through the streets of the Ethiopian Quarter, of Jeppy, and I cross the roads, my mother's name roll calls the names of dead men, Rissik, Ilof, Jeppy, and so on, through the streets of these extraordinary streets that were, this is the area that was laid out as the mining camp of Johannesburg, and where the street grid has not changed in shape. So this very tight grid of 62-meter blocks is what hosts this extraordinary shopping space. And it means they're very short city blocks. So there's a lot of traffic movement around there. It increases the density, the vibrancy of the space, but also makes it extraordinary that on one city block there can be 250 shopping spaces that you could access from the street front. And of course, when I was a child in Johannesburg, at ground level there were shops, but they were large, big box shops. So there were, department stores selling, men's suits in that area because it was close to the court and the medical spaces. Clothing, some homeware, but they were large, glass-fronted spaces, and entirely different where glass is almost redundant in the space now. There are these very small shops, sometimes 2 square meter or 1 square meter shops at ground level, facing the street, and also facing hawker stalls which front onto those shops, so that the sidewalk becomes an avenue of shopping, sort of an outdoor arcade. And then there are these very small shops that face onto the street, but also the buildings are burrowed into in these mini arcades that go through the building with small shops facing onto those arcade spaces. And so it's been re-inhabited quite differently from early Johannesburg, which fancied itself as something sort of modeling itself on a European city, and where there were arcades, there were glass-covered arcades, that much as we talk about the arcades of Paris in the book as well, with Walter Benjamin's arcades, which excluded the poor. and were putting, beautiful and expensive items on display, the arcades of Jeppe invite the poor, invite those with less spending power, but who are coming in their thousands to buy fast fashion in the space. So an entirely different space, which has pioneered, Pete, a new kind of shopping in Johannesburg, and I believe in much of the rest of South Africa. This small shop front where goods are stored elsewhere. It's much more a sort of Southeast Asian model that was not known to us even 3 decades ago. And Jeppe has put that on the map as normalized what would have felt like an informal shopping space.
It's so interesting, and I'm sure we'll get to some of the economics of that and how that economics has changed from, as you say, this idea of a street frontage and window shopping to sort of reach out and touch the goods that are on sale now in a very different way, from the macro store, big box as you describe it, to this micro units with, stocked high and wide in terms of the goods that are being sold. But I want to keep on this planning track for a moment, and again, just the personal story of yourself, which was fast forward from young Tanya with her mom as a child growing up to a town planner, mid to late 2000s, just I guess 2010 FIFA World Cup around the corner, new town and precincts like that really on the up. And again, like many of these central business districts in the world over, boom and bust, challenges, pockets of excellence, pockets of huge challenge. What was your memory of that period working in the Johannesburg Development Agency, and the first time that the Chaos Precinct is described by one of your colleagues? How does that start to, what's your memory of that space, and how you then started to piece together as a town planner the thinking around that?
Right. So although I grew up in Johannesburg and have always lived in Johannesburg, and have a career as a town planner and researcher of the built environment in this space, I had always longed to work in the inner city. And when I was given that opportunity to work in the Johannesburg Development Agency for almost a year in 2009, I jumped at that opportunity. And it was at the same time as I was working there, overseeing transport plans for parks, etc., that I was told about secret shopping centers in the inner city. And I went there independently of my work and saw this extraordinary burgeoning of, people shopping, of these tiny shops, Amharic sounds in the air, music that was foreign to me, and not understanding what was going on, and feeling that I didn't have the tools or the wherewithal to understand what was happening in my city, but it felt very big.
Right.
And I was desperate to understand what was going on. At the same time, I was working in the JDA, and we were looking one day over street maps of the city, where decisions were being made around where the JDA would invest for the next environmental upgrade. And the city has defined in its regeneration of the CBD these districts or precincts, the fashion district, cultural districts, etc., and the retail improvement district, actually, which doesn't coincide with the place I was seeing, which was just east of the retail improvement district, and felt to me like the real retail was happening in that space. But anyway, we sort of had pens on paper and were looking at reasons to do environmental upgrades where there was private sector had invested, or where the city might want to attract private investment. And as pens were sort of hovering over where that investment might go, the manager in that space at the time said, we can't invest there, it's the Chaos Precinct. And that struck me so much and has become the title of the book, precisely because I think that examining the space enables us to look at Johannesburg differently, to look at chaos differently. And also for me, the burden was to understand the logics within what was a seeming seemingly chaotic precinct. And so it's a very powerful label and provocative, because the book is about unpacking and arguing against the label of the Chaos Precinct.
It's of no surprise that, we're seeing Johannesburg in the headlines on a weekly, daily basis around chaos, about mismanagement, and often this thing of the opportunity, the aspiration, and again, this idea of transformation from what it was to what it could be, I think is one of the real messages in your book. Around, you talk about it being a lodestar. I had to actually look up what is a lodestar. But if I understand correctly, sort of a model, an opportunity for replication of what a new city and a new role, if you like, for Johannesburg could become in welcoming this type of retail space, or welcoming the diversity in terms of the people and the community that has grown up. Perhaps you want to tell us a bit about who is there now. It's defined, I think, quite strongly as being an Ethiopian quarter, strong Ethiopian representation, and it seems to have been driven at some stage by the migration through war and other challenges in that space that you describe in the book. But tell us a bit about the stories, and I think that even extends to you going up into Ethiopia and meeting some of the characters who are Johannesburg residents but returning into their home space. Tell us about the people, tell us about the personalities that you met, and how that starts to work towards this, I say, transformation of identity and opportunity in this precinct.
So, post-democracy, South Africa has become a space of migration, of increasingly a space of migration of people from the rest of Africa. But our democracy coincides with the fall of the Derg in Ethiopia, and an extraordinary transformation in that society, and people who fled in that period, fled to many places, but also found refuge in South Africa. And that was one of the first waves. The early 90s was the first wave of Ethiopian migrants to South Africa. Subsequently, there are other waves, and often they've coincided with political crisis or opportunity in Ethiopia. But Ethiopia is a big place, and there are many different reasons why people might leave the country or might seek opportunity elsewhere. In the case of masses of people coming to South Africa, there are a couple of important facilitating moments. So on the one hand, those those political moments in Ethiopia, but also the promise of South Africa. And in the book, I talk about two particular facilitators who sort of laid bare the possibility of coming to South Africa and of it being a place of promise. The one was an ambassador in South Africa from southern Ethiopia, and a space which was under quite strong political pressure, and a place where there wasn't at that stage much opportunity for youth. And the ambassador, through bringing his own relatives to South Africa and then them bringing more people and so on, encouraged people to come to South Africa for opportunity. So he's one of the key facilitators. But another key facilitation avenue has been churches, where the promise of that a southern route would open, almost as a prophecy, for Ethiopians to find their fortune and to change the lives of their families, was promised through churches, and that so that is another factor in the mystique of South Africa being a promised land. But to turn to how Ethiopians came to the space and changed it. So these buildings were many of them were virtually empty in the early 90s. medical officers had migrated north to Sandton, to Rosebank, to other parts, had suburbanized,
Sure.
from really the period of the 80s. The inner city had been disinvested in the late apartheid years and was not a place of particular promise. But there was some shopping and selling going on. There was some warehouse type selling in those spaces. And so people would come in there to buy goods that they might sell elsewhere. And it was Ethiopian migrants who had come here and were selling belts or wallets or so on the streets and buying from Chinese wholesalers, South African Indian wholesalers, Jewish wholesalers in that space, and selling on the street there, but also at taxi ranks elsewhere. It was amongst them that a number of people saw the opportunity or tried the possibility of opening a shop inside one of those medical buildings. And I had the wonderful privilege of meeting over I've worked in the space for 15 years and finding the first 3 men who opened shops in one of those buildings that's colloquially called Medical One, who took the opportunity to open a shop and then to start supplying other sellers, other Ethiopian sellers in the space, and then gradually making a space where people could have Ethiopian coffee or injera, and make a safe space for Ethiopian migrants. But also, slowly they began to open more shops that other Ethiopian migrants, took space in. But there was also the coincidence of Ethiopians arriving here and Chinese retailers and wholesalers arriving in the country. And that coincidence was really important, as Ethiopian retailers in the inner city, and they continue to do this, buy from Chinese wholesalers and break the bulk in the inner city. So there are many Chinese malls west of the inner city where these goods come in, the fast fashion comes in. And one of the important supply chains is that goods come into those wholesale malls and are purchased by Ethiopians who sell them, from these building spaces. But I don't want to simplify it to this is just Ethiopian space. There are many migrants who work in the space, but it was pioneered by Ethiopians and still is primarily traded by Ethiopians in these hybrid shops, which are sort of neither formal nor informal. And yes, I met many people through the time, and in some cases have maintained contact with them over the 15 years. But I did, in order to understand the space, I needed to have conversations, and that was the passage into the stories of people's lives and the remaking of the space.
I'm sure we talked about this the last time. I think a lot of what you're describing there is not just the affinity you have for the area that goes way back, but also this idea of building trust with the community in that space and being more than just somebody who's coming and asking questions or being curious. But I think you've embedded yourself in that. You've found ways to engage with community leaders, the community at large, and I think that speaks volumes in terms of the sort of the research methodology and how you've gone about this. And I say that even extended to you visiting Ethiopia itself. Do you want to maybe tell us a bit about that, Tanya? Because like I say, that sort of goes beyond the normal remit of I'm studying a precinct, I'll tell a story. It's like no, I'm going to travel thousands and thousands of kilometers north and east to tell a story in a more authentic way. I think that's a really impressive part of this story. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and recollections of it.
Sure. So I had met and talked with and tell the stories of, property developers who had transformed space, of people who worked in shops and their stories within the space, their stories of secretly bringing in goods at night or hiding from the police, which is a major story in the space as well. of their own personal lives, of stories of loss, of people who live, in South Africa, but obviously retain a presence in Ethiopia, people who have had to leave, who cannot go back because they're political asylum seekers. So the stories within Johannesburg are never just centered in the city, but always have an arm elsewhere, and people feel, in many cases, that they're living in limbo here. So, so I felt the need to understand a number of things. The one is to see the spaces that people who I was interviewing came from, but also to follow the stories of those who had returned back to Ethiopia, and particularly to Addis from South Africa. I wanted to interview them. I also wanted to see spaces like Mercato, the biggest open air market in Africa, which is in Addis, and to see how that might, mirror, reflect what was going on in Johannesburg or not. But so I wanted to meet people who had gone back to Addis, and I did. I met people in Addis called the Joburg Boys. So, young men who had returned, or who were older, who might have spent, up to 2 decades in South Africa, attempting to make good, and in some cases had made good, in others not, but who'd gone back to Ethiopia. And it was extraordinary for me, because there's also a sense, within the community here, that because of the dangers of Johannesburg, but also because of interpersonal issues of competition, of surveillance within a community, that although there are certain freedoms in Johannesburg which might not be present in Ethiopia, there are also restrictions, even within your own community, about how you can exist and how you can present yourself. And I guess this is true for many migrant communities, certainly families who we interviewed, who, in Yeovil and elsewhere, where you don't display your wealth or your success because of the nature of competition in that space. And so there was a sense of the Joburg boys in Addis, who also identify as a different group of people who've almost been like comrades in a war, who are in Ethiopia now, and who are recognized as the Joburg boys because of how they dress. And there was this strange thing that you could almost be your authentic Joburg self in Addis in a way that you couldn't in Joburg once you had gone back. So it was wonderful to meet some of the, some men who had gone back, and to talk with them about their lives in Johannesburg and gone back. But also the major sending place in Ethiopia for migrants coming to South Africa is the area in Hosanna, in the southern area. And I went to Hosanna as well, which is about 6 hours from Addis, because on Jeppe Street, a waiter said to me, Hosanna has changed because of Jeppe. And so with that research question,
amazing,
I went there. Many discouraged me. There's nothing to see in Hosanna, etc. But it was an extraordinary experience because it changed me. It changed me in my perspective. I think until then, Peter, I had been so full of the wonders of, Ethiopians making good in South Africa and transforming the space and bringing a prosperity and a hope, into the inner city, and the positives of that, and had not fully grasped the difficulties, the negative, the stress, the brutal attacks on migrants in South Africa, and how much of the story is of loss, of violence, and of death. And in Hosanna, I was confronted with that. I was confronted in a very stark way with what was a naivety, I think, and that one cannot be naive about the complexity of doing business in this country as a migrant. And that shifted my perspective, and shifted the stories, really.
Again, a reminder of the sacrifice and the challenges that people face, and again that idea, and I think that's a really interesting sort of summary of, as you say, the naivety, perhaps the great story, but coming with a huge amount of cost. So thanks for reflecting on that. You talk a bit about, or not a bit, you talk a lot about this opportunity of the precinct to really reframe our thinking about Joburg and about many of our inner cities in and around South Africa. Can you tell us a bit about that aspiration, what it could look like, and what the response needs to be of the authorities? Because so much of this, I guess, comes down to bylaws, regulation, management of urban spaces, or lack of urban management, lack of enforcement, and then that opportunity or things being filled in informal ways without any sort of structure. And that's where, the formal sector will run a mile, and it will run to Sandton, it will run to Rosebank and as far away as possible. But is there an opportunity to find balance, or is this transformation and reconfiguration of that space very much rooted in what you've seen there in the Chaos Precinct?
So in 2017, I oversaw a big study where we interviewed 300 shopkeepers and 400 shoppers in the space. And that enabled us to put some numbers to how big is this economy. And from calculating how many people were coming on buses at various times in the weeks and across the year, and seasonal movement, and what people were spending, just those people coming across the border to spend in the inner city. This excludes South African spending in that space, and there are many, who are South African spending in that space. We estimated that on average, cross-border shoppers are spending 10 billion rand a year in this precinct. At that stage, that was twice the annual turnover of Sandton City Shopping Centre, which was the biggest mall in Africa. So we cannot dismiss this as an aberration.
Sure.
We dare not dismiss it as problematic and that needs to be solved through the kind of policing that's going on in the space. So buildings are under stress and strain with the enormous amount of goods that are in there, with the lack of proper management of buildings in some cases, although that's also shifting. In some cases, there are newly built buildings by Ethiopian developers and by other developers, and some buildings are being well measured, many are not. And I would not okay that at all, that there needs to be proper building management. However, what under the guise of management and of law enforcement, under the guise of we are policing counterfeit because it's bad for the South African economy, what actually happens is that there's a huge criminal enterprise of policing that exists in the space, and that on a weekly basis, there are massive raids, often violent, in the space, very, always aggressive, and where goods are taken, not only counterfeit, but also unlabeled goods, are taken by authorities under the guise of effective policing, are taken out of the space. We know there are syndicates operating where those goods are often sold back into the space. There have been very few, if any, arrests of people for counterfeit goods, and yet this is happening day after day after day. What it's doing, the aggression of that, the scale of that, is that it is disincentivizing cross-border shoppers coming here. And that, I think, is a huge danger. Because the cross-border shoppers, Pete, if we were even to say, at worst for the South African economy, that there were migrant traders or foreign traders buying foreign goods from foreigners in our city, at the very sort of worst, for if that was a problem for the South African economy, we could still capture so much of the money in transport, in the services we can provide, in the accommodation of cross-border shoppers. Instead, we present to them this incredibly dangerous city whose danger, whether it's mugging, rape, murder on our streets in Johannesburg, is not being effectively policed by our police forces, because our police forces' attention are being directed to self-enrichment from the very goods that these people are buying. And so we have this skewed policing of the area in order to keep it safe, in order to make those very cross-border shoppers safe, rather than that they should be sort of stripped down for their documents and be threatened with arrest, and sometimes arrested and put into trucks where they are held until they pay a bribe. Both traders and shoppers are experiencing this. What's happening is we're squeezing this place. We are attacking the golden goose. And I say that because I think that, this vitality of Jeppe is not just an exotic implant in the inner city. Far from being the chaos precinct that is ungovernable, it is potentially a lodestar for navigating the future of Johannesburg. Because this is Johannesburg finding its place amongst African cities on a continent that is bound together by trade, by migration, by diversity. And I think it's time that Johannesburg reckoned with itself as an African city, and that it opened its doors and rolled out the red carpet for these shoppers. Because even if it's not fast fashion that we're moving, can you imagine the network, the ecosystem that's been created, which we're not looking at, of supply chains, of the movement of goods sold by small traders, bought by petty traders, by informal traders, who move those goods to the vast expanses of Southern Africa, to the far sort of reaches of wherever a road will go, and take, a spotted red t-shirt or a handbag or bales of goods, on trucks and on buses and through their own efforts throughout Southern Africa. This is a footprint, an extent that corporates wish they could have access to.
Sure.
And if we could understand that ecosystem, what other economies, what other flows could go through it? This is how Chinese fast fashion reaches Southern Africa through our city. What an incredible opportunity that Johannesburg is this entrepot, is this port, this trading post that we don't recognize. We police, we ignore, we dismiss. And I think that there's so much opportunity to relook at it in a different way, and to capture so much of the opportunity from it.
I'm smiling because I think both you and I worked under former Mayor Tao in Joburg, and I'm just thinking now of his role as, was it Minister of Trade and Industry, if I'm not mistaken. The pitch that you're making surely would resonate with Minister Tao around, that the unintended consequences of a particular approach that's been taken, and the missed opportunity. So again, thanks for reminding us that it's not necessarily always the negative story. There are real opportunities which are being foregone here, and that there's the chance to do something different and expand our horizons, expand the economy, I think are very clear in your book. I want to bring it back to the book. You've talked really eloquently, Tanya, and thanks for indulging me and taking me on the tour, if you like, of the people and the place itself. But tell us about the book, how it came about, when it's being launched, how people can access it. I think those are always the important things when we talk about the launch of something. It's like, okay, when, where, how much, and where can I get my hands on a copy?
Okay, let me just say that in terms of the people in the book, there are many stories of many people in the book, and they're deeply personal, and they are hopeful, and they are heartbreaking, and it's the people of the book and the human stories which I think are the most captivating, albeit that it is also a book about the place and its economic potential. And for me, the wonderful work that I've had the opportunity to do has been those 15 years of speaking with interviewing, going into the homes of either here or in Ethiopia of the people who are the protagonists of the story. And so all credit to them if the book is a good read. But the Chaos Precinct will launch in August, on the 23rd of August in Jeppe. It's very important to honor the stories with the launch in the space, and then the 26th at Love Books. But there will be other launches and other opportunities to talk about the work. It is about a 300-page book. It has a photo essay by Mark Lewis in the center of the book. It is a beautifully made book, and it will be available wherever you get your books, at Exclusive Books, Love Books, the Book Lounge, and other stores, and also directly through Jacana Media or online through Jacana.
Fantastic. I know I've got an Exclusive Books voucher, so now I know what I'm going to do with it. So hold on to it. Lovely stuff. Will we see you down here in Cape Town on any of the sort of book launch tour? Any thoughts about, other than Josie, where else you might be heading to discuss this?
I hope to be at the Open Book Fest in Cape Town at the beginning of September. And failing that, certainly to have book launches in big cities around the country.
Wonderful stuff. Well, Tanya, from my side, it's been, as always, a real pleasure. And I say this, really strongly authentic adventure you've been on, that put yourself into what most people would run a mile. Let's have it right. Most people would be like, this is not where I want to be. So much talk these days about smart cities and news, and here you are showing the potential of that which exists. And I think that's such an important part of our narrative going forward in 2025. And I was thinking there, is this version 2.0 of Job? Of course it's not. It's like version 22.50 of Josie. It's been reconfigured so many times, as I say, from the mining camp to the retail to, it's gone through so many stages, and it continues. And that's what a sustainable, resilient city, all these words that we throw around quite easily, but sometimes it comes with a different complexion and a different texture, different network. And I think you've really helped me again rethink some of that. And I hope people will find a lot of pleasure in the stories in the book, and more strength to you in wherever it's taking you as well. Anything on in the pipeline? Where next? I mean, it's always my question when we do these book reviews. I suppose on the one hand, it's a relief. You've got it out of the system. You get it launched. Where to next? What's on your horizon?
Well, I do say that it took me 15 years to write the book, because once I stepped into Jeppe, I never wanted to leave. So I do hope there'll be more work and opportunity within that space. It is extraordinary, but I am also working with Mark Lewis on a book, and with Mark Lewis and with Phil Harrison on a book on the suburbs that surround the inner city. So
that's quite a collaboration. That's quite a trio. I really look forward to that. Tanya, in the meantime, please look after yourself. Very best of luck with the launch. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today, and looking forward to hearing about it, and hopefully get a chance to see you when you're down here for the Book Expo. All the very best to you.
Thank you so much, Pete. Thank you. Always good to talk to you.
Cheers for now. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. If you have enjoyed, please do like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Please do tell your colleagues and friends about the work that we're doing and the content that we're generating. We're forever indebted to Tribal Need for allowing us to use the track Flags as our main theme tune for this series. And if you have comments or suggestions, if you want to be part of the Talking Transformation podcast, please do reach out to us via talkingtransformation101@gmail.com, or contact us through the Blue Sky platform at TTPod.